For 19 winters, the sky over England was bruised by the smoke of burning villages. It was a time when the law was a memory, and the only right was the power of the sword. History calls it the Anarchy, a period so lawless and brutal that chroniclers famously wrote that Christ and his saints slept. This was the mid-1100s, an era where two cousins, Stephen of Blois and the Empress Matilda, tore a kingdom apart to decide who had the divine right to wear the crown. Welcome back to Lemmy History. This is episode 3 of our 4-part series on Rise of the House of Plantagenet. If you're just joining us, the stage is set for a catastrophe. King Henry I is dead. His nephew, Stephen of Blois, has seized the throne in a coup, breaking a sacred oath to the king's daughter, Matilda. In our last episode, we saw the great betrayal, the political maneuvers that put the crown on Stephen's head. But a crown stolen in the dark must be defended in the light. As usual, you can understand this episode without having watched the others. But now, back to it. This wasn't just a war of soldiers, it was a war of fortresses. It was a game of cat and mouse, played across muddy fields and castle battlements. It was the moment the House of Anjou forced its way into the English bloodline through a marriage that Matilda initially loathed, but would eventually use to give birth to a legend. Today, we enter the heart of the storm. From the narrow escapes in the snow to the capture of a king, we witness the bloody middle act of the rise of the Plantagenets. This is the age of the sword, where a kingdom was lost, found, and ultimately broken. By 1138, the king's peace was a total fiction. Stephen's inability to say no to his barons had turned England into a patchwork of private war zones. The greatest blow to Stephen's legitimacy came from within his own family. Robert of Gloucester, the illegitimate son of the late King Henry and the most powerful general in the realm, finally made his choice. He sent a formal message to Stephen. He was renouncing his fealty. He was declaring for his half-sister, Matilda. With the defection of Gloucester, the Cold War turned hot. The Empress was no longer a distant threat in France. She was an invading force, and she was angry. Before the first arrow was fired in England, we have to look south to Normandy and Anjou to understand the fuel behind Matilda's cause. To her supporters, she wasn't just Matilda, she was the mother of the future. This brings us to a marriage that changed the world. Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou. I touched a little bit upon it in the first 2 episodes, but now it is the right time to look into it in depth. Back in 1128, King Henry I had forced a marriage between his daughter, a widow and former Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, and a 13-year-old boy named Geoffrey, the heir to the county of Anjou. Matilda, who was 26 at the time and used to the company of emperors and popes, reportedly despised the match. Geoffrey was a mere count, a teenager, and most importantly, an Angevin. For a century, the Normans and Angevins had been blood enemies, fighting over every inch of border territory. But Henry I was a master of the long game. He knew that by marrying Matilda to the House of Anjou, he was protecting the southern flank of Normandy. Geoffrey was nicknamed Plantagenet because he famously wore a sprig of yellow broom blossom, the Plantagenista, in his hat. While the marriage was famously unhappy, characterized by frequent arguments and long periods of separation, it was biologically successful. By the time the war in England truly began, Matilda had produced a son, Henry. This changed the stakes of the war. Matilda wasn't just fighting for her own right to rule, she was fighting for her son's inheritance. Every castle she took was a cradle for the future King Henry II. The Plantagenet name, born from a humble yellow flower, was about to become the most powerful brand in European history. That the matriarch of the dynasty didn't really like the man who gave the family the name is one of the particular ironies of history. In September 1139, the war finally arrived on England's shores. Matilda, accompanied by Robert of Gloucester and a small but elite force of knights, landed at Arundel on the south coast. This was the moment of truth. If Stephen had been a different kind of king, a more ruthless one, the war might have ended that afternoon. Matilda took refuge in Arundel Castle, the home of her stepmother, Queen Adeliza. She knew her since she was 8-year-old. Adeliza was one of the first friends Matilda made when she arrived in the Holy Roman Empire. But that was the past. Stephen quickly marched his army south and surrounded the fortress. He had the Empress trapped. If he had starved her out or stormed the walls, he could have ended her claim forever. But here, Stephen's chivalry, or perhaps his indecision, betrayed him. In a move that baffled his own generals and has debated by historians for centuries, Stephen granted Matilda a safe conduct pass. He allowed his greatest rival to leave the castle and travel across the country to join her brother Robert in the west. Stephen believed that by letting her go, he was acting like a true Christian knight. In reality, he was handing his enemy the keys to a civil war that would last another 15 years. Matilda reached the city of Bristol, turned it into her headquarters, and the map of England was officially sliced in two. For the next few years, you have to visualize England as a fractured mirror. The East and the South, including the vital prize of London, generally stayed loyal to Stephen. This was the land of trade and established bureaucracy. The West and the North, anchored by the power of Robert of Gloucester in Bristol and the King of Scotland's influence, belonged to Matilda. But between these two power blocks was a no-man's land. In counties like Wiltshire, Gloucestershire, and Oxfordshire, the war was a nightmare of local sieges. This wasn't a war of massive, pitched battles like Hastings. It was a war of castles. Barons would build adulterine castles, illegal, hastily constructed wooden or stone towers to dominate the local countryside. The suffering of the common people reached a fever pitch. Because neither Stephen nor Matilda could fully pay their troops, the soldiers lived off the land. They burned crops to starve out rival garrisons. They tortured villagers to find hidden stores of grain. One chronicler wrote, "To tilling the ground was as vain as tilling the sand of the sea." The very fabric of English agriculture and society began to unravel. The turning point of the war came in February 1141 at the city of Lincoln. One of Stephen's own allies, Ranulph of Chester, had seized Lincoln Castle in a private dispute. Stephen, trying to assert his royal authority, moved to besiege it. But Robert of Gloucester saw an opportunity to decapitate the royalist cause. He marched a relief army through the winter mud to catch Stephen by surprise. The Battle of Lincoln was a chaotic, bloody affair. Stephen, showing the personal bravery that had always made him popular with his knights, fought like a lion. Even when his men fled and his sword broke, he continued to fight with a heavy battle axe until he was finally struck down and captured. For a few months it looked as though the war was over. The King of England was now a prisoner in chains at Bristol Castle. Matilda was no longer just a claimant, she was the Lady of the English again. She marched toward London to be crowned. The path to the throne was open. The oath sworn in 1127 was finally being realized. But Matilda's victory would be one of the shortest in English history. In June 1141, she arrived in London for her coronation. But Matilda was not an expert in the soft power required to rule the fiercely independent Londoners. She demanded a massive tallage, a tax, from the city to pay for her expenses. When the citizens complained that they were already impoverished by the war, she reportedly dismissed them with imperial coldness. The Londoners, who had always preferred Stephen's easygoing nature, reached their breaking point. As Matilda sat down to a celebratory dinner at Westminster, the city bells began to ring. not in celebration, but in revolt. A mob of angry citizens, supported by Stephen's wife, also named Matilda, Queen Matilda, rose up and chased the Empress out of the city. She fled so quickly that her dinner was left uneaten on the table. At least this is what the reports tell us. This was the Empress's greatest mistake. By failing to secure London, she lost the religious and symbolic heart of the kingdom. The momentum shifted instantly. The war then moved to Winchester, the site of the royal treasury. In a confused struggle known as the Rout of Winchester, Matilda's forces were surrounded by a fresh royalist army led by Stephen's wife, Queen Matilda. In the desperate retreat, the Empress's sword and shield, Robert of Gloucester, was captured. This led to a strategic stalemate. The royalists had Robert. The Angevins had King Stephen. Neither side could win without their leader. In November 1141, a great exchange was made. Stephen was traded for Robert. Both leaders returned to their respective sides, and the war was reset to 0. It was as if the last 3 years of blood and fire had never happened. The kingdom was back to a state of total, exhausting equilibrium. If there is one moment that defines the grit of the Empress Matilda, it occurred in the winter of 1142 at Oxford. Stephen had trapped her in Oxford Castle, and he was determined not to let her escape a second time. He surrounded the city, waiting for the freezing cold and hunger to force a surrender. As Christmas approached, the ground was covered in a deep blanket of snow, and the River Thames was frozen solid. In the dead of night, Matilda performed a feat of legendary daring. She and 3 loyal knights dressed themselves in white cloaks to blend into the snow. They were lowered down the castle walls by ropes. Moving like ghosts, they slipped through the enemy lines, walked across the frozen river, and trekked 6 miles through the blizzard to the safety of Wallingford Castle. It was a cinematic escape, but it symbolized the reality of the war. Matilda could survive, but she couldn't win. And Stephen could besiege, but he couldn't capture. By the late 1140s, a strange phenomenon occurred: war weariness. The great barons who had fueled the conflict were dying off. Robert of Gloucester, the heart of the Angevin cause, died in 1147. Without him, Matilda felt her grip on England slipping. She realized that she would likely never be crowned queen. But she didn't surrender. She pivoted. She returned to Normandy to manage the territories there, leaving the fight in England to her son, young Henry Plantagenet. Henry was now a teenager, and he was proving to be a military prodigy. He was faster, more ruthless, and more charismatic than both Stephen and his mother. Stephen, meanwhile, was falling apart. His eldest son and heir, Eustace, was a brutal and unpopular man who many feared would be a worse king than his father. Stephen's primary goal was now simply to ensure Eustace would inherit the crown. But the church, led by Theobald of Bec, refused to crown Eustace while Stephen was still alive. The stalemate had become a spiritual and political deadlock. In 1153, the final blow fell on Stephen. His son Eustace died suddenly, reportedly out of grief or rage. With his heir gone, Stephen's will to fight vanished. He was an old man, tired of 20 years of inconclusive slaughter. The war didn't end with a final battle, but with a weary conversation. In late 1153, Stephen and the young Henry Plantagenet met at Wallingford. They reached a historic agreement known as the Treaty of Winchester. The terms were simple. Stephen would keep the crown for the rest of his life. In exchange, he would adopt Henry Plantagenet as his legal son and heir, bypassing his own surviving children. The House of Blois would step aside, and the House of Plantagenet would take the throne. Stephen had won the crown for good, but he had lost the future. He died less than a year later, in October 1154. The 19-year nightmare of the Anarchy was over. The man who had stolen a crown ended his reign as a caretaker for the son of his greatest enemy. Thank you for joining us for this third chapter of the rise of the House of Plantagenet. In our final episode, we will see the arrival of the man who would build an empire. We will follow Henry II as he transforms a broken England into the center of a European superpower, and we will see how the Anarchy shaped the laws and the spirit of the English people forever. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, hype, and comment to help my channel with the algorithm.